What I'm going to talk about today is something very basic and very, well, basically very, in some way even preposterous to an ENT, to a non-ENT, non-medical, but technical audience. So please forgive me if I present some of the stuff here that I've done before. I've done this last time at the demo session in Gathertown for those people who joined. But anyway, here we go. So this is our university hospital in Aachen town. It looks pretty modern still, although it was basically dated back in its conception to 1968 and finished in 1984. So that took merely 16 years to build. And we're based right there, here west of Aachen town and spot on the border to the Netherlands and Belgium. So it's a pretty nice site. The problem with older hospitals in general, of which we have a lot, is that operating theaters tend to be quite small. Because way back in 1968, what did you need for an operating theater? You needed an anesthesia machine, you needed an operation table, anesthetist, nursing staff, and a surgeon. End of story. Okay, so over the last 5 decades, we have accumulated a lot of additional equipment that somehow needs to be accommodated to the theater. And while we're talking about 3D in the consumer market, I'm not a marketing expert, neither an engineer, but we all know that consumer 3D had its last peak starting in something like 2004, peaked until 2009, 2010, and then slowly declined again to about 2014, when most consumer brands retracted from the 3D market, and it's now starting to pick up again. Different so in professional medicine, because we're actually slower to adopt new stuff. But when it starts to really cling to grip, then 3D is really useful in the OR. So just to show you a few examples, that's what we have here. We have the Ariscope, a fully digital 3D microscope provided by Arnold and Richter in Munich. They're usually producing professional film cameras. But this is a fully digital microscope, and the thing you're looking at when looking into the binoculars isn't actually a see-through image of the object you're pointing at, but it's actually 2 video monitors you're staring at. And secondly, those of you who've been attending SD&A for a long time, you know Avi Yaron and his Vision Sense stereo endoscope. It's sized down to 4 millimeters, so that's also feasible for ENT. And not stereo, but also 3D is obviously the rendering of the patient's inner lining, so to speak, by navigation, which is a major mainstay of surgical orientation nowadays. And we have started off using the binoculars and replacing those with a true vision camera here at the side port of our operating microscope, an ordinary size model. You all know this device here, the Da Vinci robot. It's a master-slave system, which hasn't really picked up in, or hasn't come to terms in ENT, but they're trying to desperately to bring it home to us. And finally, this is an exoscope. It's a distant 3D camera that has microscopic features, but no binoculars, so you're operating off the screen. So just to give you an example, all those devices are, well, basically large. They do have a large footprint, and they all have to fit within the OR, and that's the situation now. Here we got the anesthetist, we've got even bigger anesthesia machines, we've got the operating microscope, nurse, surgeon, etc. So the problem is that with increasing number of devices on the OR floor, with huge footprints and also complex cable connections, you do have a lot of cluttering in the OR nowadays, which can even imply a working hazard. So in addition to that, you've got large amounts of visual information all over the place on different consoles and different machines, and this raises the workload and obviously the stress level for the operating surgeon. So we'd all like to have this, a nicely cleaned up, organized OR with very little machinery and obviously the visual information integrated in the wall. So this is being planned, so the planning stage of our new OR tract right in front of our front door is underway and it's being finished, but given the time frame, I know from experience, I can well imagine that I will never be able to operate in this environment before retirement. Okay, and this is quite a time off yet, I can assure you. So at this stage, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Professor Hackenberg, who's our new head of department, and my alter ego, Tian Duong, who's doing a lot of operational stuff as me, and Professor Westhofen one day before his retirement, so that's why he's so relaxed. Okay, good. And there's a special reason to it why I depicted him, because we started with our project way back in the beginning of 2017, when Professor Westhofen came up with this idea to integrate, let's say, a video wall into one of the walls of this operating theater that wasn't designed for this purpose in the first place. So it took 2 years of UKA facilities, our, well, basically on-premises firm, to evaluate, measure, re-evaluate and re-measure the whole thing again before, after 2 years, they came up with the notion, no, we can't do it. It's too complicated. And mind you, that this, what you conceive as a wall, isn't actually a wall. It's just an inner lining of the sterile field, which can be easily washed and cleaned and disinfected. The real wall is actually behind it. So you can't attach anything to this sort of inner lining, which is only 1 centimeter thick. So the idea was, that's what our devices department came up with, why don't you create a cart? Okay, so we created something mobile, versatile, on a cart that could present imaging text information to the surgeon in 2D and 3D and record the whole stuff in 2D and 3D and stream the content to any place in our department and beyond. So that's it. That's the idea. 150 meters, 5 foot high and 7 foot wide, 4 screens. These are ordinary Samsung 47-inch monitors in 4K, and that's a 3D monitor. That was the first challenge, to get hold of a 3D monitor in 2020. Okay, so what we did, Mike Weisman isn't here, so he'll slap me for that. We actually dismantled his design of True Vision Systems because it had a broken graphics card anyway, took the JVC monitor off that and put it on the card. Okay, and it works perfectly. It just works beautifully. So the signal from these various sources like navigation, endoscopy, right side or left side, microscopy, left and right, is fed into one of the 3 pods around the theater, and these actually one of 3 interfaces feeds the whole thing in the back of the wall and onto the card. I'm sorry for this very busy slide, but the most important thing is actually you've got 3 or 4 SDI lanes. These feed the 3D stream from left and right into separate recorders. These are Blackmagic design recorders on SSD. And they're synced, of course. Next, the same signal is fed into a 3D multiplexer side by side, frame compatible, and can then be streamed over the local area network into the lecture hall or wherever. And of course, this signal actually comes from the microscope and is fed into the 3D monitor. Same happens with the endoscopy monitor, which is monocular yet, and the navigation monitor, which can actually be switched from navigation to an additional monitor of what signal is fed into the LAN system. And the 2D stream is actually recorded separately on an AJA halo and also transmitted separately into the LAN system over that lane. So this is the last time I'm going to show you this slide. You've seen it the third time now. So the idea is that the wall sits about here, the mobile video wall, and it's not actually mobile. It's just being, let's say, movable so you can clean the floor underneath. But what you have to move is the operating table. So if you're operating on an, let's say, right ear, you take position 3. If you're operating on the left ear, it's position 2. And if you're operating on the nose, then you look at the patient's head and the video wall beyond. So without further ado, this is what it looks like in action. This is Tian Duong performing endonasal sinus surgery. And this is him again. The first image was actually the 3D macroscopic image, and then we switched to 2D endoscopic image to look around corners. And here's a little video on that to show you switch a little bit better. I hope it runs. Oh yeah, now here we go. Okay, so that's the navigation probe, and you can see at the lower monitor the image moving accordingly, so he's at the back of the sphenoid sinus. So there's no blood there because he's actually very close to the carotid artery. It's just a very thin shell of bone in between. This is why you want to have some sort of navigation and also vision. So it's now changing to the 2D endoscope using the navigation probe again. So this, you can tell this from the lower image on the lower left. The lower right image actually shows the ordinary data from the radiology department. That's just part of the hospital information system. So that's all pretty intuitive because you only have to look at basically one set of screens. Okay, next case is, if we still have time, I think so, is a very rare case of dehiscence of the superior semicircular canal. The semicircular canal is part of your vestibular system, and it sometimes happens that the bone overlying this canal is missing. So anytime the patient coughs or sneezes or presses, strains that stool, he'll actually get dizziness because there's no bone covering it, and any change in pressure inside the brain will actually exert a sensory feeling of, well, basically vertigo. So this is what this model is all about. That's the superior semicircular canal, usually covered by bone. Here it is missing, this piece of bone. And we usually, in that case, ask 3DI, a company from Jena, to create patient-specific ceramic implants to put onto that bone. So to access that, it's a little bit tricky. This is Professor Westhofen now. Because you have to actually take a little piece of temporal bone out. This is the dura. So we're still outside the dura. It's not neurosurgical stuff. But we shove the dura apart a little and put those ceramic implants in. This is why we need the full spectrum of endoscopy, 3D stereo video for microscopy and navigation system as well. And on top of that, we would also want to have some sort of monitoring system for the hearing, because the hearing organ is obviously fluid-wise linked to the vestibular organ. So we also have a BERA brainstem evoked response audiometry in that. So these are pictures from older days because, unfortunately, due to COVID, we didn't have students in the OR for the last 2 years or so. It's slowly picking up, but we have used the True Vision system before, and we're going to use this again, basically the video wall again, to have a lot of students seeing that. And on top of that, another difficulty or another drawback is that we do have 2 Christie's projectors in each of the big lecture halls, 1 each, but the service in Germany is a bit poor, so I think it's not Christie's fault, but they have been off duty for a couple of months now. So in conclusion, or in discussion, there are some certain advantages which make this sort of device favorable for the surgeon. It's very low cost. The configuration can be extremely versatile. We only use off-the-shelf products. It's all compatible with OR and hygiene regulations if it's not within the direct surroundings of the patient. So you stay away at least 5 foot. And if used frequently, you just set it up once and it's a turnkey system. On the downside, this initial setup is extremely complex. Troubleshooting can be quite challenging, so they have to call the department's nerd, in that case me, and 3D recordings require alignment in post. And if it's not used for a while, then you have to reconfigure the whole thing. So in conclusion, it works. We do have a mobile, semi-mobile 2D, 3D video wall for use in operative theaters that serves as a unique monitoring hub for the surgeon and auxiliary personnel. It can be used to retrofit theaters that cannot have any major alterations to their setup, to their architecture, where you can open the wall, and the design takes a lot of strain and workload off the surgeon. So I think that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justus.